Okay, so we're beginning a class today on the prophet Joshua, Yehoshua. But we're not going to start with him. We're going to start with what is prophecy and who is a prophet. Then we're going to learn a little bit about Joshua himself and his life, biographically. And then the Sefer itself. And the result of it, if we're successful, is that we'll understand exactly what Israel is today and where it should go.
Just a question. Joshua is of Yoshayahu, right?
Yeah.
I always put a Hosea, Hoshayahu, those books.
Yeshua.
Yeah, Yeshua.
What?
Phone and a pen.
Phone and a pen. Here's a phone. Here's a pen. Here's another phone that you might be interested in.
We're expecting a call from Rabbi.
So why do I make this outrageous claim about having a complete understanding of Israel? Well, to get everybody's attention, but also because where are we in history today? The Jews have returned to the land of Israel, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but never given to them. Right? They were strangers in this land, right? And eventually they left and went to Egypt, and only with the return, not of Moshe, but of Joshua himself, did they take the land as a nation. They take the land. They were what people might call today the first settlers, right? But they were also the people fulfilling the promise made to the Avos. Where are we today? We're not far from them. We recently conquered the land. We're struggling with it. The world doesn't accept it. Many of us don't accept it. What kind of government we should have, how it should operate, how the discordant views within Israel should be worked with to be the most effective nation, were all very serious issues that Joshua and later the judges had to cope with. Living in the Midbar was a miraculous existence. Building a nation was much less so. Of course, the military victories were, as they are in our own time, miraculous. But the trials and tribulations of creating a government of people, a society that was no longer living in the clouds of glory, but living on the land, growing crops, having a yearly cycle, having issues of based in, dealing with crime, dealing with all kinds of other things, these were the nature of nation building. And I think that those of us who can think back to the earliest memories we have of Israel, the modern state of Israel, remember it as a glorious shining light, that the people had returned, that they had turned the desert into a thriving garden, that they had conquered the mosquitoes, that they had won wars that were miraculous. People who had come out of concentration camps had fought battles against trained armies and emerged victorious. And the stories, touched everybody. Some of us growing up in North America took great pleasure in planting trees in Israel each year. We would make little donations to organizations that we always thought there was a tree with our name on it somewhere, a little plaque at the bottom there. A lot of jokes about it. But the truth was that for both Jews and non-Jews, the earliest stages of the state of Israel were a glorious example of democratic values, of the conquest of the weak and the righteous over those who would deny them their rights. And I think it was very tremendously inspiring, and maybe it peaked in 1967 with the Six-Day War. And after that, there was a sense of what some of us might find almost a curse in the Torah that happened, that we wanted to be like other nations. Right? You know, when Samuel was asked to find a king, it's clear that finding a king is not something that is objectionable to God. He planned it. It's in the Torah itself. But the phrase that we want to be like other nations is very troubling, because we know that Yaakov is to be a nation alone. We have a very specific mission that is given to the Jewish people. And it's not like other nations. And our history over and over and over proves that it's not like other nations, whether we like it or not.
But who was the first to say we want to be as other nations?
That phrase was a phrase that we used with the judge and prophet Samuel, when they asked him specifically to find for them a king, because when they came out of the desert and they conquered the land, the people who were in control of the nation were the judges. They weren't kings. For many, many, many years, they were the judges. But at a certain point, they came to the last great judge was Samuel himself, and said, we want to be a nation like other nations. And then he had to go and look for the king, right? And he chose Saul, and then later he tore the crown away from Saul and gave it to David. Our history of kingship is very mixed. You know, there was Solomon and there was David, Hezekiah, but there was also Manasseh and Ahab and a long list of quite disastrous kings. The role of the prophet, as defined by Judaism, is a very changing role. That in the earliest days,
Hello? Yeah.
the role of the prophet Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moshe, the greatest prophet of all, right, were people who were simply conveying, either to themselves or their family, messages from God. With Moshe, there became a stage of reproof, of musar, of telling the people that they should change their ways at times. But mostly it was making the case with God that the people deserve better. That was a quality of Abraham. That was a quality that we cherish in Moshe Rabbeinu as well. When we entered the land, the prophets remained, to a very large degree, seers. They were people who, and there's some interesting numbers that we should look at. The Talmud tells us that a couple of things that touch on the book we're going to learn specifically, but also tell us about Nevuah and prophecy itself. For instance, the Talmud tells us that there were twice as many prophets in Israel as there were people who came out of Egypt. Got that? Twice as many prophets in Israel as the numbers of people who came out of Egypt. That's a minimum of 1.2 million prophets and prophetesses.
You mean while wandering in the desert?
No,
in Israel.
throughout the history of Israel.
Throughout the
History of Israel.
It's a call for them.
Yeah. We have a record of 55 of them. 48 men, 7 women. So you might ask the question, you know, where is the other 1.195 million prophets? There's two ways to understand it. I would say that it is accurate to say the prophets for whom we have records are prophets who were active in the political life of Israel. That they were a guiding hand for what Israel was to be, and public players.
Different times.
So that if you were, one example we have of the prophet, it's very interesting, is Shaul, right? When Shaul was a young man, right, he couldn't find his father's donkeys. The donkeys had disappeared. Looking here, looking there. I think we all have this experience. We lost something, right? So, some people say, you should put a coin in the pushka and say somebody's name, and, maybe that will help find it. You couldn't find your donkeys, 5 or 6 donkeys, right? Go to the prophet. He went to Samuel and said, where are my father's donkeys, right? And Samuel said, told him where they were. Because Samuel actually saw where the donkeys were. Right? And he was able to tell them. We would see it as a trick today. It wasn't. It was kind of casual. So these 1.2 million prophets and prophetesses were highly evolved people, tremendously sensitive to human nature, but also had managed to subdue their own physicality to a point where they could hear the voice of God speaking to them. And they could help people who needed help. Help with a shidduch, help with a job, help with education, help with a place to live. All the normal things of life, that people, with children, with whatever, you could go and get good advice. Right? Very domestic, very private and personal. Not unlike sometimes the relationship people have with a rabbi or with a Hasidic rebbe. The difference being that their advice was not their own personal advice. They were giving advice that was correct advice always, because it was from God. But let's go back to the ones we do have a record of for a second. The Talmud tells us something else than I told you. I told you that it had to do with their role as public figures. Right? And they had books, recorded their behavior. But that's not what the Talmud says. The Talmud says, I think I have it here. Okay. 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses. This is from Masechtas Megillah in the Talmud Bavli. 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses prophesied to Israel. They did not detract from or add to that which is written in the Torah, except for instituting the mitzvah of reading Megillah. So they didn't change any laws. No laws. It's taught many prophets arose in Israel, twice as many as those who left Egypt. However, only a prophecy needed for future generations was recorded in the 24 books of Scripture, and that which was not needed was not recorded. So the Talmud gives a very different reason for the existence of the books of the prophets, of Nevi'im. Not because they were public figures, but because future generations, and by the way, not because of what they did even in their own time. It says here they didn't change anything. They didn't change anything, right? Except the commandment to read the Megillah. That was it, right? Okay, Megillah is important, very important.
All Megillah?
Right? No, the Megillah. Megillah says
Esther?
Yeah. So what does it mean, right? It means something very important, and something that we don't appreciate about all of the Navi. The record of the Navi is recorded for future generations, not as a piece of history, but because it will impact us directly, much more directly than it did the people of their own time. That was the purpose of these books
like
that we read.
Documentation,
right.
like a documentary.
The Gemara goes on to say that had the Jews not sinned, and they're talking about multiple different kinds of sins, that there would only have been 6 books given to the Jews. The 5 books from Moshe Rabbeinu and Yehoshua. Why is that? Because the 5 books given to Moshe Rabbeinu really give us the history of the world, as we understand it, as well as the entire framework, moral framework, legal framework, the constitution of the government, right? The ethics of the people. Yeshua gives us the structure of the nation itself, of how you build the nation once it's in the land. Right? The other prophets spend a great deal of time dealing with tremendously important issues that develop because of our missing the mark, so to speak. I think that if you look, you'll see that there are two very, very central messages that are throughout all Nevi'im. Right? One of them is, for want of a better term, the social safety net. This tremendous concern for how we act to our brothers. Right? When you're living in the Midbar, and everybody gets paid with an omer of mun each day, right? It's very much, for those people who
provided.
For those people who grew up in a society that was a socialist society, it echoes this very much. It seems like there is a centralized power that provides everything. Food, water, shelter, everything is provided, right? And people live, in many ways, quite an idyllic existence. That changed, when they came into the land. And they had to go from that society to a society in which there were some very rich people and some very poor people. And there was a middle class, and there were merchants and there were farmers. There were horse traders and there were chicken raisers. There were scribes and there were, brilliant Rabbi.
Is it post-Egypt?
What?
Post-Egypt?
In the land itself. People had careers, right? In that situation, there would have been inequity that would have developed. Because there would have been some people very rich and very successful, and some people very poor. And the prophets don't say that shouldn't be, but they make very clear a central concept that's in the Chumash, that unlike other societies which believe in the survival of the fittest, the Torah commands the Jewish people that the most powerful and those that are fittest are responsible for the weakest. Responsible for the stranger in your gates, responsible for the orphan, responsible for the widow, responsible for the Levite who doesn't have a source of funds, right? Responsible for those who can't defend themselves. This is actually the role of a Jewish king. Right? We see later that where do the Jewish kings all come from? They come from what tribe?
Yehuda.
Yehuda, right? And what is the capital city of the tribe of Yehuda?
Hebron.
Bethlehem.
Bethlehem?
Right. But if you pronounce it properly, it's Beit Lechem. Right?
That's what David
Beit Lechem is the house of bread. Right?
David's family was from Beit Lechem.
From Yehuda. They were from Yehuda. But the capital of Yehuda was the house of bread, which is a hint to the responsibility of a Jewish king. Not security, but to make sure everybody is well off. That those that do not have bread have bread. And it says David, who is the example of what a Jewish king should be to a large degree, says he got up in the middle of the night thinking about this. How people would be fed, how people would be cared for. Right? So when the Jews came to the land of Israel, their idyllic existence of everybody had what they needed. Nobody had too much, everybody had what they needed and they were cared for, changed. Some people had a lot more than they needed for their own families, and some people had almost nothing. And this was one of the themes that's central to all of the prophets. Another theme, the other theme that is central to all the prophets, and it's very closely related, is the idea of the destruction of Avodah Zarah, of foreign worship, of idol worship. These two themes, to a very large degree, formed the personality of what the world perceives as the Jew. The Jew as, the liberal Jew, right? Who is very concerned with the welfare of others, who's concerned with civil rights, who's concerned with political change, who's concerned with progressive movements. This is centralized in the message of the prophets, that you are responsible for those weaker than yourself. And the fact that the expression, the prophet is despised in his own time, is understandable, because he performed the task of bringing the mighty to be accountable for their behavior. Nobody likes that. Nobody likes that. The destruction of Avodah Zarah is a theme that continues in our own time as well, but in a different form. We find it almost impossible to understand the attraction of idol worship. The Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. This desire, tremendous desire, but it was central to our ancestors. They were constantly struggling with this issue. Unless we think it's just foolishness, we should kind of look around ourselves today and see what it is that we worship today. The majority of people in this world, Jews as well as non-Jews. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that it is addictive, dangerous, and probably more foolish than Avodah Zarah. And probably less pleasurable, I should add, as well.
Probably the word worship we would disagree.
No, I wouldn't disagree. I think that when people give up everything for...
It's addiction. I understand what you mean.
No, they think that it's the center of joy and happiness, of fulfillment. Right? And then they're disappointed, and then they go back and do it again, more so, in an effort to chase it down.
But still, it's not idol worship.
The idol worshipping, at least
something that you put in front of you, and you just
and you think that
pray
it's
and you ask something. It's just we have our addictions. I agree, it's addiction, but it's no. I don't think it's idol worship.
Depends what. Depends what you mean. What you mean.
We don't believe that computer. That they believe that the idol was affecting their lives. I mean, would be in control of their life. Mm-hmm. In case of computer is in control of our life, but because
we're
we're
not asking for something. Give me money.
We're not?
No, we're not. We're not standing before a computer and just give me money and I will give you...
You know, one of the most popular forms of taxation today is the lottery.
Yes.
Yep. We're going to the government and giving them $1.
God to give you...
We're not praying, but our actions are the same. We're sacrificing to it constantly.
No, actually, I agree with that.
We sacrifice constantly for benefits that we hope to get that are as much or more mishigas than it was in the time before.
Before it was physically, like really, literally, like
worshipping, pure worship even today. Aboriginal people carved tree, and they feel that it has some magical power, so they pray, whatever, ask it to give them everything. So, and they expect it to fulfill their dreams.
Actually,
that's worshipping probably.
There is a perfect example of
this. There are
this.
lots of people who like worship.
There is a perfect example of
that they will give up everything just for that.
There is a perfect example of what we do worship.
Huh?
And we hold to be a perfect truth that we worship, right? And that is scientific progress, right? There's no question that is our idol today in terms of that which we believe in, per se. The nature of science is unlike religion. Religion, to a very large degree, is about analysis of the unobservable. That is to say, we observe patterns around us and come to certain conclusions. Science is about observation through tools, right? Through different mechanisms, right? Whether it's a microscope or a, telescope.
Yeah.
And what we find is that science changes on a regular basis, its conclusions, right? In our own time very dramatically as to its definition of an expanding universe, a static universe, all of those things. But we always believe in whatever the latest statement is from science. Do we expect science to give us things the way our ancestors expected gods to give us things? Maybe yes, maybe no. I think that we don't. I think that we have a belief system that is founded only on that. Generally, I don't mean necessarily the people at this table, but generally society. Right? And I would say that, with all due respect to the great scientists of our times, most of them would say, yes, it's a very flawed process. We do the best we can with what we can observe, but it's a very flawed process. So to put as much weight into it as we do is an interesting question, and as much dependence as we do. But I don't want to dwell on it too much, except to say I think that it's safe to say that we do not have the focus that we should have in terms of uplifting ourselves into a better world. That we're dragged down by our desires. And by the way, one of the qualities of Avodah Zarah that was so attractive, that we don't talk about a great deal, but it was central to the success of Avodah Zarah, was sexuality, right? Mm-hmm. That this was central to all ancient faiths. The idea of temple prostitutes, the idea of orgiastic behavior as part of it, right? So there was a lot of physicality and pleasure that we seek in other places today. Mm-hmm. The sense of morality could be kind of twisted, as if to say, well, the gods are like this too. So if we want to act in a godly fashion, we can have an orgy as well. It's consistent with our framework, and that's because we invented the gods, so it works that way. The prophets, let's come back to the prophets for a second. So the prophets cried out against these two things centrally, right? One of them was Avodah Zarah, mm-hmm. and one of them was the injustice mm-hmm. that people felt. Yeah. And the two are closely linked. If you believe genuinely that man is a godly creature, then the respect for the individual becomes very, very powerful.
What does it mean, godly creature? Sorry, I missed.
Halak Elokim, that he is created by God, that he is in the image of God, so to speak, right? I don't mean the physical image of God. If you believe that he's just another animal, right, you have a different view of life being cheap, right? So the prophets, and we see this to be part of the nature of the Jewish people throughout history. This fanatical concern for every individual human life in a world in which this is not a popular view. People sacrifice themselves. It's part of. We don't hold that way. We hold that you should live. Right? And it's tremendously important. Israeli, it's interesting to see how it filters down. Israeli weaponry, its design, puts a tremendous emphasis on the survivability of the users of it. The emphasis is on that before the emphasis on the effectiveness of attacking. In the early days, and in World War II, being part of a tank brigade was a tremendously dangerous and horrible role, because if you died in the tank, it was an awful death. The Israelis, when they built their own tanks, the Merkava, they put a tremendous emphasis on its defensibility and on protecting the people inside the tank. Nothing is perfect, but that was the focus of it, right? And so it's been with all of their weapon systems. Some would say, well, it's because they're a small nation that they value every human life. I don't think that's it, because we value human lives beyond our own as well. So these are the two focuses of the Navi. The definition of a Navi is, Rambam gives a brief definition, which I'll read to you. This comes from his Hilchos Yesod Torah. Among the foundations of the religion is to know that God makes people prophets. Prophecy can rest only on a scholar who is great in wisdom, powerful in character, whose inclination cannot subdue him in any matter on earth. Rather, his intellect always conquers his inclination. That is to say, his mind is more powerful than his desires. And he possesses vast and exceedingly reliable wisdom. A person filled with all these traits, who is sound in body, is very important, because prophecy is a physically demanding activity. Sound in body, when he enters the orchard of the hidden wisdom and continues in those exalted subjects and attains the reliable wisdom needed to understand and grasp, and he continues sanctifying himself and withdraws from the attitudes of the common people who conform to the darkness of times, but instead continuously prods himself, training his soul not to give a thought to any vain matters or to the vicissitudes and conspiracies of the time. Rather, his mind is always free for higher things, concentrating on the wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He. Recognizing his greatness, thereupon the Spirit of holiness will rest upon him.
What is vicissitude?
The fashions of the day. Vicissitudes. Yeah, the fashion of the day.
Very elitist.
What?
Very elitist statement.
Yes. Will rest upon him. And when that spirit rests upon him, his soul will be sweetened by the loftiness of the malachim, of the angels. He will become transformed into a different person and understand with his own intellect that he is not what he was before, but has risen above the level of other wise human beings, as it is written with regard to Shaul. You will prophesy with them and be transformed into a different person. So the prophet, in order to become a prophet, is not somebody who wakes up in the morning and has a vision. He is somebody who actively trains physically, spiritually, intellectually, to become this prophet. It's not an easy process, and as we know, its rewards are few and far between.
So the people could be trained to be prophets?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They had yeshivas for prophets, for prophecy.
This I don't know. Because the prophets are, different types. Those who are unintentionally became prophets, who when the Hashem was either talking to them, or he was coming into their dreams, or he was, different types of the prophets.
It's not. There wasn't so much unintentional. So if you take, for instance, Yonah. If you take, for instance, Yonah, right?
Right.
Yonah is a famous prophet for wanting to avoid prophecy, right? And he couldn't avoid it, right? But it's not. That wasn't his first prophecy. Mm-hmm. He also trained for prophecy.
This I don't know.
His prophecy centered around the water drawing process of Sukkot, and he was famous for it. Right?
Water drawing.
Yeah, there is a Simcha Beis Shweva celebrates the pouring of water on the Mizbeach. Normally we pour wine, right? But on the most joyous of all holidays, we pour water. And this was central to Yonah's prophecy. This was when he was most effective as a Navi. Now, there is, of course, Mida Keneged Mida, measure for measure, because where does Jonah, in the end, tell his story? It's all about water.
Right.
You know, it's all about water.
Sea of
right?
water.
Absolutely. But he didn't want to give the prophecy that God wanted him to give. It wasn't that he didn't want to be a prophet. Early on, he wanted to be a prophet. But when he realized that he was being asked to prophesy to the nations, and that the nations would do tshuva and correct the behavior, and Israel would not, that the nation of Assyria, whose capital was Nineveh, was being cleansed and being prepared to be the conqueror of Israel. Jonah wouldn't want to have any part in that, right? And that's what he was avoiding. In the end, all of it happened, as we know, right? Assyria was the first conqueror of Israel, of the 10 tribes. It was Assyria. Sennacherib was conqueror. Yeah. So
that was the first temple and then the first exile.
Well, it was before the destruction of the first temple, right? It was the exile of the 10 tribes, the northern tribes of Israel, right?
So you said the nation has to be purified to conquer Israel?
First of all, we notice historically that the nations that conquer Israel are always very, very great nations, tremendously powerful nations.
Yeah, but pure?
Right? In the case of Assyria, right? Assyria did tshuva. You know?
What kind of tshuva they did? So they destroyed Israel?
Jonah went to them and told them that they were thieves and they were terrible people. And they immediately sat down and changed their ways. It says even the animals had to fast.
They conquered Israel.
Right? And then, exactly, and this was Jonah's fear. That only after this they could go ahead and conquer Israel. That he was complicit in the destruction of Israel. What?
And what about Rome?
I'm not an expert on Rome.
How pure was Rome?
Rome was not so pure.
So how they conquer us?
What?
Oh, Greece.
It may have to do with our
Well,
state.
Alexander Macedon, that he was. You were just.
So, not everybody who conquered us was pure as the driven snow. I agree. But clearly, Assyria did do tshuva prior to the conquest of Israel. There's no question about that. Right? And this was the issue for Jonah. This is why he resisted going there. Right? Because his fear was not that they wouldn't do it or they would kill him. His fear was that they would do it, actually. And he didn't want that to happen. In terms of the other nations who have conquered us, I guess, there's many issues about where we were holding at the time that we were conquered as well. I don't particularly want to go into the analysis of each conquest at the time. In fact, we want to end up with a different conquest, which is our conquest of the land in the end. And by the way, we went through a process as well, purification, which we'll come to in the story of Jonah. That everybody had bris milah before the conquest began, etc. And who were the people who finally came out of the desert,
And also, I don't know if it's relevant to mention, when we are talking about Romans who destroyed the second temple and then conquered it and everything, but it's also we know that the reason, what was the main reason, because we allowed it to happen ourselves because of the Hinat Sinam and all the behavior of the Jews. Yeah. It was not only direct physical conquer, it was also on the other level.
Just we're standing on a higher ground.
No, on the higher ground that we ourselves allowed it to happen
for
because
nation, it's
there was lots of reasons in behavior of the Jews that allowed it to happen.
There's two things. One is, from a historical perspective, that we're not usually conquered, even though we're a tiny nation, by insignificant countries. Portugal never conquered Israel.
Right.
Even though it was a great colonizer. Didn't conquer Israel. the nations, even in the tragedy of the Shoah, the nation that was destructive to Israel was a tremendously powerful nation. It wasn't small. So that's one factor, is that it always seems to be a predominant nation.
Germany was super nation.
What?
Germany was super nation.
It was a tremendously powerful nation.
Very. Before the war, they were very well developed.
I thought that Czechoslovakia was much more powerful.
Than Germany?
No, they conquered it very easily.
Yes.
Divided the territory.
That's
it.
No,
they
because
surrendered very easily.
it was something there. First of all, the all weapons. It was coming from Czechoslovakia.
At the beginning, yes. Yeah, at the beginning. But that's because Germany wasn't permitted to build weapons between the war.
They tricked something Czechoslovakia so they can conquer
the
Europe.
Sudetenland.
That was something. Because
but that's
not this, they couldn't start the war.
You're right, but what happened was, if you look at the history of it, was that Germany was demilitarized after the First World War.
Yes.
Right, and the process of the German people and the German government remilitarizing was done initially in secret.
But it was.
And then.
It was very poor, not very poor, but it was poor nation. They didn't work. The people were poor. When Hitler came to the
Germany was one of the most prosperous countries in the world prior to the First World War, and in between. Just prior to the rise of Nazism, the Germans suffered tremendous inflation. Which was very destructive, right, to the government. And Hitler came on the scene to solve this problem, per se. That's what his presentation was, right? But you're talking about a country that lost the First World War, rebuilt itself, lost the Second World War, and now is the power of Europe again.
Right.
It's
number one.
It's the nature of the people. Right? And it's something, Charles de Gaulle said, I love Germany so much, I'm glad there's two of them.
At that time it was two.
Yeah.
But they
was
were
in East and West
very
Germany
well advanced and very well developed countries, both.
So it's
written something, I believe, in Talmud, that the German tribes, they're not supposed to be united.
Ashkenaz, yeah.
Because the moment they're united, it's very bad for the world.
Yeah.
No, it's dangerous for the world. Yeah, that's what
the German tribes.
Yeah. Yeah. We see the history of it, and it repeats over and over and over. Okay, so I just wanted today to discuss what the nature of a Navi is, how a person becomes a Navi. The function of the Navi is very important, right? So the function of the Navi can either be simply as a seer. Somebody like Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, they heard things from God, they saw things from God that were very personal, that affected their families and how their families would in the future act, right? These were prophecies, right? But the prophets of Jeremiah and Ezekiel were very different, right? These were prophets whose goal, and this has to do a great deal with kingship, right? Because the judges were not the children of previous judges. They ruled the land, right? But no judge ever had a father who was a supreme judge, right?
It was inherited.
For instance, maybe the most dramatic statement is they came to Gideon after the war with Midian, the successful war with Midian. He was a judge and a leader of the nation. The men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian." That's what the proposal is. And Gideon said to them, "I shall not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. Hashem shall rule over you." Right? So the judges had a view that this was not an inherited process. Right? And to a very large degree, the judges ruled on their own merit. There were some dramatic exceptions to this, we know. But to a very large degree, that's who they were, and they ruled on their own merit. This was not true of the kings. The kings always endeavored to have a dynasty, and that their children would be the next king. And this led to tremendous corruption within the nation. And we know that in the northern kingdoms, the kings were disasters, and many of the kings in the southern kingdom as well were not so great. The prophets of those times were very different than the prophets that preceded them. The prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Isaiah, were prophets who really had two functions. One function was Musar, was rebuke. That is to say, you're not following the paths of God, you're living in a miraculous environment, and you're testing fate. You have to change your ways. If you think that the solution is to just simply live by halakha to bring you korban, this is not what God wants. And we know that the prophets periodically say that God detests your sacrifice, that he doesn't like your sacrifice, because it doesn't come with the significance it was intended to be. A sacrifice is not a bribe of God. It's actually in your own place is what the sacrifice is, as opposed to, a gift. We'll give this to God and he'll give us good crops. That's not what it was. So the prophets very often cry out, in fact, against korbanot, not because they're against korbanot, but because they're against empty korbanot.
Lack of attention.
Yeah,
Intention.
that's right. Absolutely. Yeah. So the function changes for the prophets as time goes on, from those who are predicting the future to those who are trying very hard to correct the present, to those who are intimately involved with people's lives, advising them. The thing that they have in common is that they hear the Word of God directly. Some have visions. Some have tremendously abstract and powerful visions. Ezekiel saw the wheel, the big wheel and the little wheel. They saw chariots. They saw the seven heavens. So they had to be given both the ability to see these things and, more importantly, to interpret them as well. Because abstractions you can interpret incorrectly, and it can be disastrous. So some of the prophets are very colorful, some are not so colorful. They just simply have statements about behavior that you have to change. Yehoshua is unique in this. And when we start up our next conversation, right, we're going to deal with the world in which he lived in. Right? It says about, it's very famous, the Gemara says about Moshe Rabbeinu, or the Mishnah, that Moshe Rabbeinu's Punim face was like the sun, and Yeshua's face was like the moon. The moon itself has no illumination at all. It is simply a reflection of the illumination of the sun. So what does this tell us about Yeshua? Right. We should look into that as we go forward. He was somebody who had a tremendous loyalty to Moshe Rabbeinu. He's pained personally when things are insulting to his Rabbi, so to speak. He's very concerned about it. But he eventually is required to accept the mantle of leadership and to fulfill the promise that was made to Moshe and bring the people into the land. And I think we should explore that in the next in our next meeting. Thoughts, questions?
So, what is the best example of a person being a prophet and that the prophecy was true, which will make us today believe that it was?
Sefer Torah says specifically that no prophet will ever arise in Israel that is the match of Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? So what are the differences? That other prophets more or less receive their prophecy in a dream, in a state of
trance.
What?
Trance.
Yeah, in a kind of trance-like, ecstatic state.
No, just like Moshe Rabbeinu talking directly to us.
But none of them, except Moshe Rabbeinu, spoke clearly. That is to say, the words that Moshe Rabbeinu relays to us, that God says to him, are actually words we can understand.
Right.
When you read the prophecy of Ezekiel, what God said to him and the pictures he drew for him, you know, you can spend your life trying to understand it, right? But Moshe Rabbeinu was, you know, the creators of the superhero comic strips were virtually all Jews, right? And Superman is a very interesting example of this idea. Who was Superman? He was a fairly normal person who periodically would transform himself into somebody with these tremendous powers, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, when he had a question he couldn't answer, he would say, "Excuse me," right? And he would turn to God and ask God, right? And God would give him the answer, and he would turn back and say, and God says that, yes, the daughters should inherit. Yes, we should have a Pesach Sheni. He didn't know the answer, but he could make this call at any point, and God would directly respond to him with clarity.
Communication,
right? So Moshe Rabbeinu is the primary example of this, you know. And if you look at who he was and what his background was, what his life was, it's very consistent with many of these things. He's born not as Moshe. He's born as somebody who has almost no personality. We're told that a child was born to a son was born to a man from the tribe of Levi, and from a woman from the tribe of Levi.
There was no name.
So we're only told one thing about him, right? Not his family, but that he is a Levite.
By the daughter of the Pharaoh.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it seems clear that from the beginning that he was created, that the creation of the soul was to be in many ways, a very simplistic channel for the Word of God. That is to say, he didn't put his personality into the prophecy. Right? Almost the antithesis of this is the person who is called the Moshe Rabbeinu of the Torah Baal Peh, Rabbi Akiva. Right? Rabbi Akiva was somebody who we know a great deal about, right? Mm. That his parents became Jews, that they weren't born Jews, and that he was very much a self-made man. He hated, the scholars of Judaism. He said he wanted to bite them the way a donkey bites them, not just to tear the skin, but to crush the bone, right? And through a long process that we know about, the dripping of the water, etc., right? Mm. He saw the light. A woman was involved in this process, and many things. And he became the person who created our Torah Baal Peh. When Moshe Rabbeinu went to heaven in a prophecy, and he asked God to show him the generations, he showed him Rabbi Akiva, right? And Rabbi Akiva was... Moshe Rabbeinu said to God, "What are all the crowns that are on top of the letters? What is the purpose of that?" And God said to him, "There will come a man someday who will from these crowns make piles of hills of halachas, of understandings of the will of God." And this was a problem for Moshe Rabbeinu, because as he had this relatively clear relationship with God, his thought was, well, just make the book 5 times longer. Make 5 scrolls instead of 1, right? And put all the halachas there, and we'll teach them. And God said, no, these will be determined by this person. Moshe Rabbeinu said, show me this person. So God put him in the yeshiva of Rabbi Akiva.
Who? Moses?
Moses.
Right? And the story is said from where?
It's a medrash. Oh. And he sat in the yeshiva, not in the front row, and is giving over, a brilliant exposition of a halacha based on the crowns. And Moshe Rabbeinu, sitting in the 8th row, began to kind of weep because he was lost. He didn't understand what's going on, right? And at the end, one of the students said to the Rabbi, said, "Where do you get this from?" He said, Moshe Sinai. This comes directly from Moshe at Sinai. This was a great comfort, that it wasn't off the derech, that it still came from him. So it's a very different process. In one case, it's very clear, right? And the important thing, and the thing that pains Moses the most, is clear, is when he's accused of favoritism. Because he's devoted his life with the Jews to giving a clear exposition of the will of God, as he heard it, not adding his own feelings to it. Right? And it's a struggle for him whenever it seems that he does, by the way. It seems that it pains him tremendously. Whereas with the Torah Baal Peh, we have somebody who is recreating himself constantly, to get to the level of explaining it. It's very different. But the ideal of a prophet is clearly Moshe Rabbeinu, and, he came once, and he will not come again. The Torah is very clear. Mashiach will not have that level of nevuah. Will not have that level of nevuah. Even Mashiach. Nobody will ever have that.
There is no chance in our ranks will be a prophet.
No, there can be prophets. Prophets will return.
Well, different
prophets will return, but not on the level of Moses.
So during the last 2,000 plus years, we haven't had any prophet.
It's a very good point, and you're right. We have Ruach HaKodesh, which is a sense of the will of God as opposed to the words of the will of God. When we read the Tehillim, right? Tehillim is not Nevuah, the writings of David, right? Or the Megillah, right? We say that they're written with Ruach HaKodesh, with a certain godly spirit and understanding, but not dictated by, not the actual words of God, the inspiration of God, as opposed to. So this existed after the ends of prophets and continues to exist to a lesser degree today. But there's a very interesting relationship between Avodah Zarah and prophecy. That when the men of the Great Assembly prayed to God to put an end to the Avodah Zarah, the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, they prayed passionately for some time for this, right? The Gemara tells us that a fiery lion emerged from the Kodesh Kodeshim in the temple. And that was this desire for the Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah. And that they captured it, and they put it into a barrel, and they sealed the barrel, and that was the end of this desire. Right? And we lost the desire for this at that time. It's a very, very interesting Gemara if you think about it. Right? The desire for foreign worship came out of the Kodesh Kodeshim, right? As a fiery lion, right? Number one. Number two. Number two is that once it was encapsulated in the barrel, Nevuah came to an end.
So this barrel is still sweet.
It is as though there were two sides to the coin. In a world of Avodah Zarah, you have a world of Nevuah. But when one goes, the other seems to disappear. I don't want to go into all the reasons behind it, but clearly both of them involve a great deal of passion. These two things. One is a positive and one is a negative, right? But at the time of the end of this Yetzer Hara for Avodah Zarah, where we finally came to understand this is foolishness, it's sheker, and the desire disappeared as a result of this process of the men of the Great Assembly, right? It was pretty well the end of Nevuah at that point. There were no more Nevi'im after it. And on that note, I think we'll end for today.